Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I'm your host, Rebecca Sebastian. Welcome to the podcast. And if you're new to Dialogue, a special welcome to you. And to let you know that we are in the middle of a series on true crime documentaries. So you may want to go back and even listen to the last couple of episodes, which lay some groundwork. But each week is a different conversation with someone who has made, produced, directed, or been the subject of a true crime documentary. And I'm very excited about today's interview. I watched this documentary and immediately began pursuing the filmmaker to be a guest. And I am happy to report she said yes after very persistent communications on my part. The documentary is This Is Paris, and it's a YouTube original, and it's the story of Paris Hilton, the real story of Paris Hilton. And if you're wondering what Paris has to do with true crime, well, my guest, the filmmaker, Alexandra Dean, will tell you, and so will the documentary. But what's really interesting is this is not Alexandra's first documentary. Bombshell, the story of Hedy Lamarr, is actually her first documentary. And interestingly, that film inspired Paris to get in touch with Alexandra, and that's how she came to tell this story.
I had always wanted to answer the question that people asked me when I was touring with Bombshell, whether it could happen today. Could such a beautiful woman be around us today who was completely unseen and completely misunderstood? And if Paris Hilton felt like Hedy Lamarr, I wanted to know why.
The documentary is amazing, and it touches on the troubled teen industry, which ends up being Paris's big reveal in this documentary. But it's so much more than that. It's about womanhood and aging and finding yourself and being authentic. And I think you're really going to love it. And if you haven't seen it, I will put a link to both This Is Paris and Bombshell, the Hedy Lamarr story, in the show notes. If you have seen it, you're in for a treat because you get to hear from the director herself. Also, I would like to note that Alexandra and I had many time zones in between us when we recorded, and neither of us were in our home office studios. She was in a shared hotel space with her beautiful family. I was on spring break visiting my mother-in-law, so our connection isn't perfect, but we did our best. So if you hear more noise, exterior noise than you normally do, please just forgive us. It was spring break, and Alexandra was gracious enough to speak with me while vacationing in between work projects to talk to me for dialogue. So Alex, thank you so much for doing that and for killing the small talk. And please enjoy this conversation with Alexandra Dean. Okay, I am so pleased to welcome you, Alexandra, to Dialogue Podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to talk to you because, as I've mentioned to you, I'm doing a series on documentaries and true crime documentaries, to be more specific. And while yours, I can't wait to find out where you categorize and how you categorize yours, which is This Is Paris, which is viewable on YouTube. So before we get all into it, which I want to do, could you just share a little bit about your background as a filmmaker and what led up to this film in particular?
My background's a little non-traditional in that I tried very hard not to become a filmmaker. My granddad was a producer and distributor of scripted, including Stanley Kubrick's Lolita,
wow,
and Candy, and Birds and the Bees, and Barefoot Contessa. He did a bunch of films. He was working out of Italy, so he wasn't a well-known name in the United States, but he was the Italian counterpart producer for a lot of big films.
Wow.
And I grew up with the Hollywood lore, of course, and very interested in all of that. But very much not wanting to do what they did, very much wanting to blaze my own path. I don't want to do that at all. So I went to journalism school, and I went on and, struggled between whether I wanted to do print or broadcast, ended up doing broadcast, and years traveling the country doing these 25-minute, news documentaries for Now, which used to be the domestic version of Frontline for PBS. And that was a great training because you go around interviewing people and trying to find the one way to change people's hearts and minds around a policy issue. And that way, it turns out, was one single story. You would try and find the perfect story that would change hearts and minds and try and change policy. That was what PBS was trying to do. And I absolutely loved it. And the job disappeared in the Great Recession. And I had a little baby at home and had to reinvent myself. And I ended up reinventing myself as a documentarian. And I really didn't think of the filmmaker right away. I thought of it in the terms of news. But over time, I realized that the story was what I loved more than anything. By the time I made a film called Bombshell, the Hedy Lamarr story, I was totally seduced by story, and then I really wanted to make a feature documentary that was about a person's story more than it was about news. And that was an incredible experience. And I made that with my own production company and totally free of anybody else's expectations. And after Bombshell, Paris Hilton actually was talking to her production company about making a documentary about her life. She asked if she could talk to me because she identified with Hedy Lamarr, who was this actress in Bombshell who had felt completely misunderstood because of her looks, because she was considered the most beautiful girl in the world, but actually she had invented the basis for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and GPS as we use it today. And she had been completely unseen as this inventive genius and only ever received by the world as this beautiful woman without much to say. And so Paris had somehow resonated with this figure and wanted to meet me. And we talked on Skype. And there was something about her that I deeply recognized immediately. There was, firstly, her voice wasn't at all the voice. And then, there was something about her that reminded me of my older sister, who had been through a very difficult childhood. And she had the same kind of mannerisms and the same reactions to things. And I thought there's some big trauma here that she's not talking about. And I was drawn in by the traces of trauma, because I thought something massive has happened to her that we don't know. And then I was drawn in by this resonance she had with Hedy Lamarr, because I had always wanted to answer the question that people asked me when I was touring with Bombshell, whether it could happen today. Could such a beautiful woman be around us today who was completely unseen and completely misunderstood? And if Paris Hilton felt like Hedy Lamarr, I wanted to know why.
Wow. That must have been quite a feeling to have had your film be seen by somebody like Paris, who's a recognizable name by most everybody in the world, and to relate to the content and to trust you with helping tell her story.
Yeah, it was wild. Honestly, I was on another documentary, which was a completely different thing, also women, but based in New York City. And I was starting to film it, and I had no intention of making a film about Paris Hilton. It was not on my radar at all. But the conversation with her was so compelling and absorbing, and it felt like it resonated with all these aspects of my own life that I've been trying to understand since I was a little girl, because I had grown up with this sister so much like her. And now I should explain to you, my older sister is this very, to me, very, very beautiful, very magnetic character who was wildly out of control as a child due to various issues that she was struggling with. And she ended up being hospitalized. And I ended up spending my childhood in psychiatric wards with her, trying to understand what I was seeing in front of me. And so going through that as a child has left me with all these questions about how we treat young women and how we treat psychological disorders and how we treat the mentally, who we call the mentally ill. And I wanted to just dive into all that. So when Paris offered me the opportunity to look at this gorgeous woman who was identifying with all this trauma, I had to do it.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be very hard to say no to. I can't think of a better background really than journalism for documentary making. I mean, it seems perfect to me. I'm like, oh, this makes perfect sense. You couldn't have planned it better in a way. Did you feel that served you well?
Oh, yes. I mean, look, every documentary I do, I feel is an investigative piece. And that's definitely how I approach Paris.
Okay. So in This Is Paris, the big reveal, and, I don't want to spoil everything. If people haven't seen it, it came out in fall of 2020. I'll obviously link to it in the show notes. Go watch it. But there's a disclosure that she's never revealed before. When in the timeline of shooting did you learn of this truth she wants to confront?
It's interesting. I constructed the film so that you sort of figure it out like I did over time.
Yes.
Right? It came to me in drips and drabs.
Okay.
And hints. And I wanted to construct the film that way so that you'd have that experience. For instance, I knew she had these nightmares. that woke her up in the middle of the night and that were recurrent. So she was having exactly the same nightmare, and she was waking up in sweats, very, very frightened, and her heart racing. And I don't think the body does that to you unless you've been through some very, very significant trauma. So as an investigative journalist, that set off all the bells, go and figure out why the recurrent nightmares. And so we were really lifting the veils from there. And that's the first thing you see at the end of Act 1. You see her recurrent nightmare, and you see all these hints in the nightmare, as I did, of what had happened to her.
Yeah. And the choice to convey that in animation, I thought was so beautiful. And I would love to hear a little bit about your thought process on that creatively.
Well, you have very few choices when you're talking about a nightmare, right? How do you represent what goes on in someone's mind? You can recreate it, or you can go into animation.
Yeah.
And with recreation, you really run the risk of making it feel a bit cheap, or making you feel a bit queasy, I think, because You can't really, right. I don't have, as a documentary filmmaker, all the money and the production value at my disposal to make that really convincing.
Right.
And for me, dreams often are represented in sort of an animation fashion. So for me, that the fact that this was based around a nightmare offered animation right up to me and gave me a reason to use it. And then Paris also said to me, I wish you could see into my dreams, and I wish you could see what happens. And you hear that right at the top of the film, and you see a little bit of animation right there.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to present to the viewer, I'm going to use this tool to try and show you what she's trying to tell us.
So prior to shooting, are you aware of the whole troubled teen school story, or is it coming out while filming?
I was vaguely aware. Okay. I had seen something a while ago. I vaguely knew that there had been these schools in Utah and across parts of the country. There were kind of boot camps for teens who, had misbehaved in some vague and undefined way.
Right.
And they were wilderness programs, and I knew that they were somewhat abusive, but I didn't really know anything beyond that.
So what's your approach with her to build that trust and to just, because it seems like you have a very good connection?
I would say that it wasn't necessarily easy to fully open up to me. I think she wanted to. She really wanted to. She wanted this film to be more real, but you can really see throughout the film how much she's struggling with that removal of what I call her mask, that persona of Paris Hilton. And even within a sentence, you can see the mask come off and go back on.
Yes.
So I think it was a long process for her to really try and remove the mask. And I'm not even sure we fully got there at the end. But you see enough glimpses behind the mask, I think, to start to reconstruct what happened to her and get some context for how this character, Paris Hilton, was built. And that built over a year. It took a year.
A year. You filmed for a year with her?
Around a year, yeah, roughly a year.
Yes, the mid-sentence thing really resonates because I'm in a scene and I feel like you're getting to the heart of it, and she's being vulnerable. I mean, her voice drops, like a whole demeanor shift happens, and then as quickly as it happened, the other way she presents occurs again, and it's very fluid. And so she is almost, it's like in real time a transition and happening, which is always like forward and back. It was fascinating to watch.
Isn't it? It's hypnotic. I mean, to me, being there, it was fascinating. It could be very frustrating, right? Because I would be like, it's almost like the animal coming out of the hole, come out of your burrow and talk to me. But you retreat. Or I actually often thought of it as like a butterfly coming out of its chrysalis, You would see little flags of color as it broke through, and then it would go back into the chrysalis and not be ready to burst through yet.
Oh, I like that. And it's, and not to make it sound like it's a mental illness, because it seems more like it's a product of trauma, but you do wonder, who are we getting right now? And I thought a particular scene that was so interesting was the fight with her boyfriend at the music festival, because it seemed so like the full range of emotion. Sometimes it seems her emotions and the way she presents is so restricted and composed and thoughtful and intentional. And it just looked so raw compared to how she normally is. How often did you see her in that most pure kind of not thinking before she speaks state?
Almost never.
Yeah.
I almost never saw that. That scene where she's completely, out of her mind. That sentence, out of your mind, I think, or, when you say I get angry, I'm beside myself, that out of body situation is what's required, I think, for someone in Paris's state to actually be their authentic self. So in that scene, I think she was out of her mind or beside herself because she was in this fight with this boyfriend who was trying to get her attention and, using all these different tools to get her attention right when she had to go on stage and have this big moment. And it was such a perfect illustration of, the stressors on her and the way that she used her mask to usually diffuse them. And then, finally in that scene, I feel like she rips the mask off and you just see Paris.
Yeah. And I should amend my statement by saying rightly so, justifiably angry. He really was, it was not cool and it was a terrible moment. And I think a lot of women can relate to that moment of like, can I just do my thing and not worry about everybody else right now? Can you just give me this? And I found that really refreshing and relatable, honestly, to see it.
Yeah. For me, it made me so angry to see her getting kind of clawed at on her way onto the stage for this big event.
Yeah.
And the really interesting thing was when I first sent out the screenings for notes, a lot of notes came back from men saying, I'm surprised you allow her to look like such a bitch in that scene.
I can't. I'm sorry.
And I'm like, what scene? What? Where is she a bitch?
Did we watch the same scene? Because that's not the takeaway I got. That's so classic,
I get all the time from people like, how did she allow you to let her look like such a bitch? And I'm like, firstly, she didn't have final edit. Everyone should know that.
That's one of my questions.
Yeah. She didn't allow me to do anything. I made the film and she watched the film. That's what happened. Good. The only way that I changed anything is if there was something that was factually incorrect or a violation in some way of some legal problem. Yep. That was it. Nothing else. Not a frame was. So people should know I did not make this in consultation with Paris Hilton. I showed her at the end what I had made. So she didn't allow me to do anything, but I didn't also put that scene in to show Paris the raw bitch. I put that scene in because in the narrative that I was constructing, that was the moment she bust out from behind the mask. And I thought she really laid out who she was and laid out a boundary finally with somebody.
Yeah. And what's the saying? Who said this? If you wanted me to speak nicely about you and write nicely about you, then you should have been nicer. That guy did what he did, and it's weird to see that and kind of look at her behavior as negative and not the man's. But I guess it's not that weird because that's the lens, right?
Hey, if you want to know a lot about our culture and how we treat women, make a film about a woman and wait for the comment.
Make a film about a woman who's successful and beautiful. I'm worried that people are going to, and you can tell me what the reception has been, write her off before they watch it because people like her aren't allowed to have trauma or problems, or it looks like they're self-indulgently boo-hooing. Did you encounter that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's this sense in our culture as well that if you're wealthy and privileged, you don't have trauma or some weirdness. I mean, it's not even that. It's like, and you have some trauma, oh, boo-hoo, because you have enough money to pay your way out of it.
Right.
And so that actually became a big theme for me in the film. I really go into the fact that she has these ridiculous ideas of how much money she needs to make in order to be happy. And then blowing through those ideas, every time she reaches her goal, she just raises it because the money has nothing to do with her happiness.
Exactly.
Nothing at all. Yeah.
Right. And the truth is, I think a lot of people do that. I just think our starting points are different, right? So she came into the world in a privileged, no one's denying that. She's a Hilton. So her number, a million, hundreds of millions, okay, $1 billion. That's not everybody's trajectory, but you're right. It's more a running towards something, a chasing. There's not a dollar amount that will make anybody feel okay if they're not okay.
That's right. And I think there's a famous study, right, that says once you make something like $75,000 a year and you can put a roof over your head and food on the table and that number has probably changed in the last few years, say 100,000 now. At that point, you actually don't get happier measurably.
Yeah. It's a cultural touch point, right? More money, more problems. We all know that there is something to that for a reason. So the troubled teen industry, I want to talk about a little bit because this is why I felt it was bumping elbows with the true crime genre. This is an industry we've talked about on Dialogue before. I had Josh Block on, a journalist who did a story about a boy who ran away from Sea-Doo, which I believe Paris also escaped from Sea-Doo in California. And he went missing, and he's missing to this day. And it's a heartbreaking story. There's a podcast about it called The Lost Kids. And that really shed a light on this industry for me, which I knew about it. You know, it was very big in the 80s and 90s. I hopefully it's trending downward. But how much did you learn about these practices and these places while filming? It sounds like you didn't know a ton about it going in. Did you get a quick education, and what did you uncover there?
Yeah, I actually did a whole investigative journalist dig into it at the same time as making Paris, because I didn't know how much that was going to emerge as her main narrative. And I really wanted to know what the story was. And I think I kind of alarmed YouTube, because they thought, is this going to turn into a big investigation into the troubled teen industry? You know, we got this investigative journalist on it.
Right.
And they kept being like, it's not a film about the troubled teen industry.
That's not what we signed up for.
What we signed up for. And it was fair enough to them. But, you know, in order to understand what she was dealing with here, I really needed to do a bit of an investigation. And yeah, I did uncover a lot of these horrific practices at Sea-Doo. I understood that Sea-Doo was based around a cult, Cyanide,
yes.
and and then this cult had these crazy ideas about how to treat addiction. It's like a 7-step program, and that then became the basis for this troubled teen industry.
Exactly.
And a lot of the practices, are really extreme and torturous. You know, deprivation practices that were meant for people with extreme addiction. And now they're using them on a kid who had, you know, maybe a confused relationship to their gender identity. So yeah, I understood it was horrific. I actually saw a tape of a counselor beating a child with a chair. And yeah, I knew while I was filming how bad it was. And that also guided me as I started to try and figure out what had actually happened to Paris.
So did you have to corroborate her story, or do you take her word for it? And were bringing in the other students that she knew at that time sort of your way to let the viewer know this happened?
Yeah, exactly. You're touching on something now that's very important. As a documentarian, you don't want to affect the trajectory of the person that you're documenting.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to just introduce these people if that's not something that they naturally are doing organically. At the same time, as an investigative journalist, you do need to find those people and corroborate the story she's telling.
Right.
So on one end, we were trying to find all of her roommates, and she would tell me stories about them and tell me to find them. She would say things like, oh, you have to find Jess. She was my best friend there. She's amazing. She said, we came up with this idea of Paris Hilton together, me and Jess. So go find her. So I was looking for Jess, and she couldn't remember her last name. She had it wrong. So we're like, we're looking for Jess.
Oh my God.
Provo Canyon School from this year, you know, so then you need to put your investigative journalist hat on and really go for it.
Yeah.
What happened is, at the same time, Paris had been trying to find other survivors of these schools 2 years ago. And she'd gotten a little close, and some people had responded to her, and she backed off like she was burned, you know, like it was too fast. And so she was ready again to start looking, and she kept talking about it while we were doing our investigative research. And then this woman, Katie, who had been her classmate at Provo, she said, can I reach out to Paris? I've been wanting to reach out to her for years. At that point, you make a decision. And I thought, yes, I'll say, yes, I think that's a good idea, but I'm not going to give you the contact info. You can figure it out. And Paris, you know, I'm not going to tell her to respond in any specific way, but she can figure it out. But she was looking anyway, and you wanted to reach out to her anyway. Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
That's then, as a documentarian, you let that unfold and you step back.
Got it.
But did we kind of kick up her reinterest in reaching out to Paris? Yeah, because we were doing this doc. She knew that Paris was out there and she cared. And did Paris do it because we were filming? Yeah. So you always deal with that like duality, and
yes.
You get as close as you can to the truth, because otherwise it'll feel shitty on camera.
Right. And yes. Yeah, it is a dance, and it unfolds so beautifully, and it's really powerful when, you know, they all do meet and start sharing their stories. And, you know, you just think of how Paris's life is so full of people, full of things, full of places. And seeing her with those women in particular, it was so pure. I don't know. There was something there was no pretense, you know, this was not about building or presenting. And it was just very human and real and vulnerable.
That's how I felt too. I didn't know how it would go, honestly. I knew she was terrified about it, which is why I'm filming with her all the time, going up to the time, exploring that, going up to the moment where they meet.
Yeah. And she does have to take a break, and she removes herself and comes back, and it is a lot. It's a lot.
Well, what was really interesting is when she took a break and went up to her closet, she actually tapped my shoulder because I was filming with the women, and I followed her up there. And I have this terrible old lens on my camera, and it's like dark in her closet. And I'm like cursing myself because I had no idea why she wanted me to film her up there. And I can barely focus in this bad light. And here she is having a full on breakdown in front of my camera.
Yeah.
Which I'll tell you as a documentarian never happens. Right. Never happens in front of the camera. It always happens outside the camera. And then you try and figure out how to cover it. She was doing it on camera.
Wow.
And I don't know if she tapped me to be filmed. I think she did. But she also tapped me because at that point we had this relationship of talking this thing through all the time. How it was going to be when she went into this state. And she was also, we almost had a kind of therapy buddies situation. And she wanted desperately to tell me, I'm feeling this thing. And what I'm feeling is I'm finding myself. I'm seeing myself through their eyes from before the trauma. So I can see now what I was. And I've been waiting for so long to see that person. And so, of course, when she saw that person, she had to kind of tell me who it was and how it broke through all of her barriers and made her start to understand what the trauma had done to her.
Yeah. Do you experience digital eye strain from too much blue light exposure from digital screens? Yeah, me too. Baxter Blue glasses are not your average frames. These blue light lenses filter 80% of the highest energy blue light, eliminating 99% of glare. The past year, we have all been glued to our devices more than ever. Between podcasting, watching shows and documentaries for the podcast, writing emails, research, there's rarely an hour I'm not on the screen. Our exposure to digital light has soared, and our eyes and our sleep are suffering as a result. Baxter Blue is also a force for good and provides a pair of reading glasses for someone in need for every pair sold. This is eyewear built for our digital age, and Baxter Blue is giving our listeners 10% off your next purchase of blue light, sleep, or kids glasses. Click the link in our show notes for your exclusive discount. This is the sign you have been waiting for to invest in blue light glasses. We know you will love Baxter's, and we know that you will feel the difference. Again, the link will be in the show notes. So powerful when they start naming who they remembered and how different she is and was or is from who they later learned of Paris Hilton, like the rest of the world. It's really, really powerful. So Paris seems to want to affect change in this space with these schools. Since filming, what have there been developments and what can you share?
Yeah, it's been awe-inspiring for me to see how seriously she's taken the advocacy since finishing the film. As I said, she didn't even talk about this really before filming. So the idea that now she's devoting her life to this change is it makes me actually cry when I see these news headlines. I'm not kidding. It's something that's very, it shakes me in some way to see her do this. You don't know what a person's capable of once they've kind of confronted their demons. And to see this transformation is extraordinary. And what she did right away was she started to work on the Utah legislature, because Utah is where the big daddy of all these schools, Provo Canyon School, is located. And it's also where a lot of its offspring, all these other schools like it, are located. And so she went right to the Utah legislature. She collaborated with Utah Senator Mike McKell. They introduced a bill which was specifically to stop students from being either drugged or constrained in the way that she was. They've made that finally illegal. You cannot drug or constrain physically a child in the way that she was locked in a basement.
So these were current practices?
Current practices. And we calculated over 100,000 students were possibly being exposed to these horrific practices. And so she made sure that was outlawed in Utah just last month or 2 months ago.
Incredible.
That bill 127 has just passed unanimously, the Utah legislature, and that those practices are no longer legal in Utah.
Wow.
So she's done that. And now she's going to the national level. They're really pushing a federal program.
Yeah, I can't believe that this wouldn't be federal, that this could be a state by state thing. It seems insane.
It really is insane. And it's unbelievable that it's taken Paris Hilton telling her story for all these children to be protected. But sometimes that's the power of celebrity.
What do you think the culpability of the parents, not just Paris's, in general, of the families who send their children to these schools? Is there some culpability, or do you think most of the time it's happening unbeknownst to them?
For me, the blame lies with the industry. This is a very, very profitable industry. It makes a lot of money. And it exploits its workers, by the way, as much as it exploits the children inside the industry. The workers are paid almost nothing. They have no experience. That's why the kind of abuse is happening that's happening there. And I've talked to many ex-employees who've wept on the phone as well about what they saw and the abuse that they suffered. It was a chain of abuse. And the chain of abuse was in place because this very profitable industry was squeezing every penny out of the trouble that these teenagers were in. And to me, that, voraciousness of that industry is what is culpable.
Yeah.
And the parents were drawn into it because they were paying kickbacks to therapists for these children. And the therapist would then recommend to the parents that they go. So there's a whole network of professionals then that are drawn into that through the money.
Sure.
Channel your children into these programs without you having any idea what they really are. So as a parent myself, I feel actually great compassion for the parents because it's never easy to figure out how to deal with your children's issues. Mm-hmm. And I think that many parents are just undereducated. And, obviously I plead with every parent out there listening, educate yourself deeply before you send your child to any off-campus, boarding school or camp, because you don't know what is actually happening there. But beyond that, it's the responsibility of the states and the federal government to ban this sort of stuff. We can't allow abusive practices happening in boarding schools and places where we place our trust as parents.
Yeah, absolutely. How was meeting her family that you dealt with? So you dealt with her sister, Nikki, and mom, Kathy, if I recall, that's who we saw. What was their reception towards this whole idea of being filmed and Paris doing the documentary?
Nikki called me early on and was very curious. She very much wanted me to prove right away that I wanted to make a real documentary and not some puff piece about her sister. What she wanted to hear was not that I wasn't going to just paint her as roses, that I was going to investigate. And so once I had told her that I was going to, she was on my side and turned out to be an amazing ally. Her mother, Kathy, found it very difficult to decide to do the film because, of course, she was the one in the hot seat. She is the one who had decided to send her daughter to these schools. And, I really wanted to give her a platform to explain why she'd done that. I know that a lot of people condemn her for what happened. And, I regret that that is the format of a film like the one I made. You can't get into the bigger structural problems that led Kathy to make that decision.
Right.
But as I said, that's where I lay the blame.
Yeah. You could sense it in her body language too. I would say even Kathy versus Nikki, just in terms of wanting to be there. Not that it screamed she didn't want to be there, but there's just a resistance. And I would feel it too as a mother. I am a mother. If it was me needing to answer to that time period leading up, it would be difficult. I commend her for doing it. But Nikki, you could tell, is like ready for the jig to be up for Paris. And she's like, she's a truth speaker to her sister, which was really cool to see.
Oh, she is. I mean, she can be brutal.
Yeah, everybody has a family member like that, a friend or a sister. But I'm glad Paris has that, to be honest, because I don't think she probably has a lot of no people in her life, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's huge for her that she has Nikki.
Yeah.
And I love their dynamic. It made me laugh all the time. I love sisters.
Truly.
It's great.
And they live such different lives. I mean, from what little we saw, it seems like that.
I tried to show how Paris can drive Nikki crazy. She leaves the keys and she leaves the phone and she's up and down and Nikki's waiting for her.
I know.
It's hilarious. They drive each other crazy. All siblings drive each other crazy.
Of course.
So you try and show that.
Yeah, and Nikki has kids and is sort of in this sort of established, secure place in her life. And Paris isn't, nor does she think, she doesn't know she wants to be, right? So that's this tension that they talk about, which is fun to hear her talk about, but seems to be a resistance in growing up a little bit. In some ways, she's this big boss woman, but in so many ways, she's stuck in a like post-adolescent place. How did you feel when you finished? Like, where was she?
Place of great uncertainty. And I tried to be really honest about that. That's why I finished on the note I did. You know, I had only been with her for a year. I didn't know what was going to happen as a result of these, you know, mini breakthroughs that I'd seen. So I tried to leave it where I saw it, which was that she still really didn't want to grow up and she didn't see any need to. And of course, I'm laughing about that at the end because we all age, man. That's the one immutable law. And
yes, she did not agree, which I loved.
And people got angry with me about that too. How dare I tell Paris Hilton she has to age, which is really interesting. We are in a culture that hates aging, and we hate aging women more than anything. And I want to do many docs on that because I really want us to look at that. But this was not that. Paris Hilton is somebody who's like a Peter Pan. I mean, she's very, very young looking. She feels very young. I think we do age at different speeds. I think Paris basically is about 25 on a cellular level, and she feels that way and she acts that way, and it's fine. She will age from here on out as, you know, a very young person. But I wasn't saying that. I was saying change is inevitable.
Yeah.
Maturity is inevitable. You're going through changes right now. You're maturing. You know, how is that going to affect this duality you have where you can play Paris Hilton and then be this private person? But you have to merge the two, is what I was asking.
Yes.
And she, you know, and I think that what she told me is I can't just be my authentic self. Too much is riding on me being able to put on this mask and be the Paris Hilton people expect. And yet, since the film came out, I have seen the authentic Paris start to emerge in the public sphere. You see her doing interviews in her real voice. You see her going up in front of the Utah state legislature and openly testifying about the abuse she endured and crying and getting the Utah state legislature to push this legislation through. You see her putting a lot of her own fortune behind this push to make the activism and the legislation change happen on a federal level. She's now a huge force behind this amazing Breaking Code Silence movement, which everyone should check out, which will really show you what's happening in the troubled teen industry. Yeah. So yeah, I'm seeing her actually become the person that I think she wanted to become, and that she didn't know at the end of the doc if she'd be able to become. So I think if I was making the ending now, it would be much more hopeful. But I didn't want to lie to the viewer at the time. I wanted to tell you where I was, which was I was in a state of uncertainty.
Oh, man, I appreciate that so much. And knowing that is so cool. This is why I love to talk to the filmmakers. You know, it sounds so cliche, but it is a journey. I mean, change and transformation is not linear. And you can want to change and progress and mature and be scared of it at the same time. Again, what Paris is going through is unique to her and also very universal, which again is why we watch movies about other people, because it's so comforting to know like we're all human on some level. And then the particulars of each person's story, some are just more compelling than others. And Paris happens to have a lot of compelling factors. I'm curious who you thought this target audience would be for the doc. And were you right? Like who were you thinking was going to really want to watch this and learn about Paris?
Well, I was being told again and again by YouTube and by my producing partners that we had this very big built-in audience because she has a huge fan base. And that basically that was who would watch the doc. So we needed to make sure that we understood that. I, of course, desperately wanted to bring in the audience that maybe was the Kathy Hiltons of the world who might be sending their children to places like Provo Canyon School, these troubled teen institutions, and speak to them because I really wanted them to not allow their children to go. Mm-hmm. And I was really gratified when the film came out and I started getting a lot of messages from parents saying, thank you, I was about to send my child. And then what I really didn't expect was the amount of people who were not fans of Paris's, maybe were intentionally not fans of Paris's, who watched and were changed. And they saw themselves as complicit in a world where she was really overly criticized perhaps by this, by our patriarchy.
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, do you see the parallels that I see to the Britney Spears documentary?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like the whole world needs to apologize to both of them.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think also they were lashing out when they were young. Both of them were lashing out in a world where they felt really misunderstood, in a world where they both felt abused.
Yeah.
They lashed out when they were young, and their behavior was sometimes, pretty terrible. And I think people saw that and they didn't want to forgive them. And I don't blame those people. But you have to understand, if you've been the victim of abuse, real abuse, verbal and physical, then I think you often reflect the actions of your abuser in the process of coming out of that place of being a victim. And I think when both of those women were young, in the very risky behaviors and the lashing out behaviors, you see these two women fighting their way out of being the victim of this abuse and trying to find another way to be. And in that journey, they went to some really dark places. And we looked at them and we went, those spoiled brats, those horrible spoiled brats, without seeing them at all or understanding what they went through at all.
Right.
And I think that's what we have to reckon with right now.
Absolutely. And I think it's happening. It feels like it's a burgeoning theme. And I love that you're thinking about making more content around just women and identity and aging and these standards and the patriarchy. What is next? Can you tell us what you're working on or hint at it if you can't fully disclose?
I'm doing a 10-part series for A&E that's going to air in the fall. And this time, again, it's women. Again, it's not judging a book by its cover. I think it's really about women and sexuality, this one, and how do we judge women according to how they display their sexuality, and can we let people out of that box, that old Madonna whore problem. And I think it's one we really need to dig into, and it's really fascinating. And I think that we'll find that women have been silenced in that area just because they haven't been taken seriously enough as people who have changed our culture.
I can't wait. That's a good tease, man. That is really good. We might have to have you back on in the fall. Before I let you go, and thank you again for fitting this in on your time off, I ask all my guests before we finish, what gets you up in the morning?
What gets me up in the morning? Apart from my kids.
Exactly. Always.
Still of the night. What gets me up in the morning is this burning desire to talk about these issues. For sure. With the Hedy Lamarr story, to talk about the idea that a beautiful woman couldn't possibly be smart and that women can't be more than one thing. With Paris, that we judge a book by its cover far too often. And with this one, that we like to condemn women based on their sexuality. My next one, I hope, will be about what happens when women age, because I think we become invisible. And that's a different form of silencing. I'm just burning up with a desire to talk about these things because I see them as great injustices. And I think it's time to set women free. Just let them be who they are, just like any other citizen of this great country.
I love it. Thank you so much for your insight on everything you just said in filmmaking, and specifically This is Paris. I loved having you on. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rebecca. I really appreciate it.
Dialogue is a Yellow Tape Media production, edited by Jason Usry and produced and hosted by me, Rebecca Sebastian. Please be sure to subscribe to Dialogue, a true crime conversation, wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across all platforms. You can also drop me a note or a guest suggestion or sign up for my newsletter at RebeccaSebastian.com. Be sure to join me every Wednesday for a new episode and another killer conversation.